Welcome to the Helping Conversation, an exploration and celebration of the practice, art, and science of facilitating trusting, safe, inclusive, and effective helping conversations with others.
Recorded at RockVox Recording and Production Podcast Studios in Rochester, New York. Mouth off at RockVox. RockVox.com. Having enjoyed a 40-year career facilitating his own authentic brand of the helping conversation, your host, executive and recovery coach, Keith Greer.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. Thank you, as always, for taking the time to sit in on this episode of the Helping Conversation. Back in November of 2020, I did an episode with three wonderful guests, Dr. Makini Beck, Dr. Kaya Naomi, and my good friend Steve Lysenko. And we had a great conversation back then about the work that they were all doing in the world of diversity and inclusion and equity. And so we're going to somewhat continue that conversation with a little bit more of a fine focus today. So before I introduce my guest, let me share something with you. For more than a century, education providers throughout the United States have strived and struggled to meet the diverse needs of American children and families. A complex system of biases and structural inequities is at play, deeply rooted in our country's history, culture, and institutions. This system of inequity, which routinely confers advantage and disadvantage based on linguistic background, gender, skin color, and other characteristics, must be clearly understood, directly challenged, and fundamentally transformed. The New York State Education Department has come to understand that the results we seek for all our children can never be fully achieved without incorporating an equity and inclusion lens in every facet of our work. The New York State guidelines for culturally responsive, sustaining education are grounded in a vision of an education system that creates, 1, students who experience academic success, 2, students who are sociopolitically conscious and sociocultural responsive, and students who have a critical lens through which they challenge inequitable systems of access, power, and privilege. So this concept, CRS, culturally responsive sustaining education, is grounded in a cultural view of learning and human development in which multiple expressions of diversity, example, race, social class, gender, language, sexual orientation, nationality, religion, and ability, are recognized and regarded as assets for teaching and learning. It is wonderful to hear and to read about the leadership that the New York State Education Department is providing here, maybe compared to some other states around our nation. And we're going to dive into this concept of culturally responsive sustaining education with our guests. So bringing back from November 20th of 2020, let me introduce to you Steve Lysenko. Steve is the current Region 1 Director of the National Association for Multicultural Education, a 100% volunteer organization that promotes equity in education. As a public school educator with more than 20 years of experience as a teacher, enrichment specialist, and educational leader, Steve is now an ED candidate in the Executive Leadership Program at St. John Fisher University's Department of Executive Leadership. His area of research is in culturally responsive leadership and the implementation of the New York State Education Department Culturally Responsive Sustaining Education Framework in predominantly white suburban secondary schools. Steve is slated to defend his dissertation in August of 2023. He and his wife Jennifer plan to move to the city of Rochester in the summer of 2023 upon the graduation of their youngest son Max from Webster Schrader High School. Together, they have 5 children and stepchildren, as well as their 2 Shih Tzus, Leo and Odie.
Can't forget the Shih Tzus.
We cannot forget the Shih Tzus.
No, sir.
Steve is excited, as am I, about launching his educational consulting business, Excellence in Educational Equity Consulting. So please join me in welcoming into the Helping Conversation, again, Steve Lysenko.
Keith, this isn't only murders in the building? I thought this was only murders in the building.
Okay.
No, I'm just kidding. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, so glad you're back.
Glad
And
to be
so
here.
glad we're here to have this conversation as you are moving in this new direction for you.
Yes. After 22 years in public education, now
Right.
moving into, both the consulting world and the world of post-secondary education. I'm excited for that. I'm hoping to be moving into that post-secondary education. If anybody, knows of a job hiring a white dude in the world of diversity, equity, and inclusion, by all means, please give me a call. We're still applying. Actually, no, this is a really good time for me to be looking for positions at this moment in my career and at this moment in American history.
Yeah.
It's really a solid time for all of that to be moving and be all in motion.
Yeah. So when you were here the last time, a couple of years ago,
Yes.
I think you were in a state of some transition
Why? Yes, I was.
with your position with your school district at that time. So catch us up a little bit on what's
Okay.
been going on and how you have now come to be in this ED program moving in this direction.
So, thank you, Keith. So, in September of 2020, if y'all will think that all of you in the Rochester, New York area, will remember that on Wednesday, September 2nd, it came to light that Daniel Prude had been murdered by Rochester Police Department officers. Now, Daniel Prude was a mentally ill gentleman and was experiencing a mental health crisis. Some would say that he was under the influence of LSD and this, what's it called? Something delirium. It seems to be a common phrase that we hear in black males getting killed by police. This excited delirium, I think is what they're calling it. Or anyway, he was, whether or not he was under the influence of drugs, alcohol, or whatever, he was in a mental health crisis, was naked in the middle of the streets. 3 cops, one was doing a diamond-shaped push-up on his head, on Daniel Prude's head, while he was naked with his hands bound behind his back in the middle of, in a sleet. It was sleeting, and it was on March, on or about March 24th, when all of a sudden, after 3 minutes of being subdued, one of the cops realized, oh, Daniel's not responding, nor is he fighting. Oh, wait, he's not breathing. He's in cardiac arrest.
Right.
A week later, he was taken off of life support. So on September 2nd, it came to light that not only did this happen, but there was an apparent cover-up by local politicians, including the then mayor, Lovely Warren, and then Chief of Police Laron Singletary,
Right.
who's now running for Congress, by the way. But that's another story for another day.
Right.
I gathered with other people on that Wednesday in protest and really out of just disgust. It was my first time as a white person ever having a negative interaction with the police. So that afternoon, we were out in front of the public safety building, and I witnessed the police, this young man with a skateboard, armed with nothing but a skateboard, Keith, shake the barrier between the protesters and the cops. And the cops opened up 3 or 4 rounds of pepper balls, like about the size of, I don't know, how to explain it, but they're the same size as a paintball if you've ever had that, maybe an inch in diameter. This kid got hit 3 times in the chest and just for shaking the fence. And that really made me question, well, is it more than just a few bad apples in the barrel?
Right.
If this is how they're responding in this situation, what are they doing when we're not looking?
Right.
So I chose, my wife and I chose to join the demonstration and protests, the peaceful march that was happening on Friday night, September 4th. And that night, there were 1,500 to 3,000, estimates vary, of us marching throughout downtown Rochester. And, we ended up being kettled. For those of you that don't know what kettled means, is imagine having a throng of, between 1,500 and 3,000 people, all on foot. And then they were all on the Court Street Bridge. So the Court Street Bridge runs between the Dinosaur Barbecue and the Public Safety Building with the War Memorial off to the right. 1,500 to 3,000 of us. Let's call it an even 2,200, okay? 2,200 of us were caught from behind by the cops and from in front of us, the Rochester Police Department. And we stopped marching. Now, we'd been marching for about 2 hours and hadn't had any problems. Some would say that, there was some disruption of some diners at the Swan Dive and the Ox and Stone on Alexander Street. Yes, it happened. I'm not sure how disturbed they were, but that's debatable. It certainly was not on the scale of what happened on the Court Street Bridge. On the Court Street Bridge, the police officers gave us a warning to disperse. They declared the gathering illegal, and unlawful, and they said, return from whence you came. So we were confused. I mean, there were 2,000 plus people on this bridge. Some of us decided to move back. Some tried to move forward. Some stayed put. There was just confusion. And if you look at the video, some 20 seconds later, they being the police, whoever they were. We're not sure if it was RPD or the state police or members from around county police officer organizations, lobbed tear gas and pepper balls into the crowd to disperse the crowd. That was scary. My wife and I started to recede with the rest of the crowd. But there were young people that were, so there were multiple young women that I remember that evening. My wife and I helped scoop them up and get them off to the side so that they weren't trampled. They had been overcome by the tear gas. And this really was poignant for me because my oldest daughter's 25 and my second oldest daughter, she's now 20.
Right.
And I couldn't help but see their faces in the faces of those girls that we were scraping off the ground. So that was pretty bad.
Yeah.
Using our bodies to shield those behind us so that they could get to safety, pelted with dozens, if not hundreds, of pepper balls all the way back across the bridge. But then, my wife and I, we both have asthma, and we were seeking aid from a medical aid provider. And we were just rinsing out our face and our mouths and our nose so that we could breathe again and get back to our car, and we were going to go home just like we were directed. There were probably 8 of us seeking aid from this person with the water. And across the street, there were 2 cops. I don't know what organization they were with. Couldn't see what organization because they had blocked that off with black tape and couldn't see their badge numbers. A, they were across the street, and B, I was still having pepper spray in my eyes. They continue to rattle off bullets at us. We're not sure if it was rubber bullets or pepper balls, but again, dozens of rounds. And, all of us immediately put our hands up in the air and tell them to stop shooting. I don't think we exactly said stop shooting. Yeah. There may have been some other flowery words included there, but it wasn't until their canisters were empty that they stopped firing. I mean, they fired until they were done. And that's just how it was that night. It was apparent that these 2 officers, whether or not they represent all the officers that were there that night or not, those 2 meant to cause harm against me and my wife and the people that I was with after we were seeking aid, after we had already surrendered.
Right.
So I might have been a little upset. I may have said some bad words and talked to God, and probably not in the way I should have. But as I was walking back to the car, I got thinking, I've been watching the protests and been a part of the protests for the last couple nights, and all I'm hearing on the media and all I'm hearing in my Facebook feed amongst my quote-unquote friends was, well, if those people just wouldn't demonstrate, or if they would just be more peaceful, then there wouldn't be a problem. Those people, by the way, were, the people that were there were white, black, Hispanic, Asian, people of all races, but it was deemed a Black Lives Matter demonstration, but there were so many hues of skin color that were represented there. But that same voice wasn't being heard in the way in mainstream media. So I wanted to put something in my own quote unquote private Facebook feed. Lesson learned, even if I have the privacy settings set to private, nothing is private once you put, and quite honestly, I was enraged.
Yeah.
I was outraged and, wasn't thinking straight. And it had just been through a traumatic incident. And so in that state, I posted a Facebook Live video in which I expressed my disdain for what we had just encountered. And I may have used a term from a Beastie Boys song, or no, not Beastie Boys, from one of the early rap songs.
NWA, I think.
NWA,
right?
thank you.
Yeah.
I believe it was F the Police.
Yeah.
And I may have used some of that language in expressing myself. And, because I was an assistant principal in a district that rhymes with Schmenzerport at the time, that was outrageous.
Right.
That was deemed outrageous. Somebody took it upon themselves to take that video off of my Facebook page, transmit it to a gentleman who goes by the moniker of John Adams. Thank you, John, for being brave enough to, post under your own name.
Right.
Not. And then he took it upon himself to post it over to the Monroe County Republican Committee's site, where you can still find it to this day under one of their videos. It then went from there all the way around the world. I was getting calls from CNN. I was getting calls from the London Globe. I made it to the Spanish newspapers in Spain.
Right.
And with all of that, death threats against me, death threats against my family. There were death threats against the people that I worked with in Spencerport.
Right.
And for that, I'm truly sorry. I would ask people to realize that is not my normal behavior. That was an exception to my rule of being a professional and being an advocate for all children, but especially students of color and their families.
Right.
And unfortunately, I was suspended with pay, and eventually it became apparent that we weren't going to find a way for me to be able to work in public schools in Spencerport again. So we figured out a way for me to exit, and in a way that was acceptable to them. And, I wish the children and families and Board of Education and leadership in Spencerport nothing but the best.
Right.
I would say that what happened to me, this cancel culture that both sides of the aisle in Congress have been talking about needing to stop, it happened to me. I was canceled.
Right.
What I would say is that, and one of the things that I'm really interested in and invested in is restorative justice. If we are going to simply continue to cancel one another out and not listen to each other on whatever your political bend, none of what's going on in our divisive America is going to be solved.
Right.
I would also argue that, it's beyond time to talk about conversations of reparations and healing for, all people of color in this nation, all people that have been marginalized in this nation through policies and laws and procedures and systems of oppression that have been put in place by the government at one time or another. And it's time to, for one, our children to be taught the entire United States history.
Right.
And two, because we didn't learn it, Keith. I mean, you're much younger than I am, but I don't know about you, but I never learned about the Sullivan Campaign when I was in school. I didn't learn that one of George Washington's first acts as president of the United States was to send a gentleman, I believe it was General, if not General, it was Colonel Sullivan, to the state of New York and eradicate the Iroquois Nation.
Right.
That was George Washington's first act, one of his first acts as president of the United States.
Right.
It wasn't that the Iroquois caught smallpox. It wasn't that the Haudenosaunee people were trying to resist. It wasn't that they were causing trouble. They were living here in peace on this land where we're recording right now.
Right.
And trying to be good neighbors to this new nation. And Washington ordered them to be killed. Right. Genocide.
Mm-hmm.
Genocide, if by any other name. I mean, you can't call it anything else except for genocide.
Right.
So what have I been doing since September 4th? I have officially resigned my position in Spencerport. I have begun, and I'm more than halfway through at this point, my doctorate work at St. John Fisher University in the executive leadership program. My studies are surrounding an area of research that is related to positive white racial identity development. And what does that have to do with the culturally responsive sustaining education framework? So for the first time, New York State has said, instead of looking at our diversity as a negative,
Right.
like we just need to peacefully coexist, or we need to be the melting pot.
Right.
We just need to get over all of our problems from the past. We've had a black president. We're now a post-racial society. No. There's still discrimination, and there's still policies and practices in place. And one, we need to embrace diverse students and their families and welcome that and recognize that we're stronger because of that diversity, not only as a school, not only as a district, but as a state.
Right.
And two, we need to actively work to unravel those systems of oppression that have been in place for centuries.
So I've shared this with you before that I had this opportunity a couple of years ago in my role within my faith community, when my faith community decided to put a Black Lives Matter sign out front of our synagogue. At the time, I was president of the synagogue, and so I got to field some of the questions from congregants who didn't like that. And it was fascinating and worrisome and sad and maddening to be in this conversation for me as someone of the Jewish faith, talking to somebody else of the Jewish faith who was telling me that institutional racism is a thing of the past. And yet that's a pretty loud narrative out there, right? That maybe it was, but no longer. So enlighten us, Mr. Lysenko.
Thank you for bringing that up. I don't think your congregation or congregants are alone.
Right.
I believe that in the vast majority, I'm not going to talk about those people out there. I'll just talk about myself and my own story. It wasn't until 2016 that I really became curious about these concepts of privilege, about oppression, racial diversity, and Black Lives Matter, and all of that. It was something that had been in the back of my head. I'm half Jewish. I know that if Hitler, when he comes back from Argentina, were to drive that train up to my house today,
it wouldn't matter that you're half.
It wouldn't matter that I'm half. A single drop is enough for me to be on the train and off to whatever camp.
Right.
Putting that aside, I had been blissfully unaware in my life in suburbia. I grew up in Irondequoit, a predominantly white school district, went to predominantly white schools, Cornell, Geneseo, Oswego, Brockport, Fisher, all of them predominantly white.
Right.
Worked in predominantly white school districts, Webster, Bloomfield, Spencerport. So as a white male, middle class, things were pretty okay from my perspective. And unless there, aside from people that can smell the Jew in me,
right.
And I'm not trying to be offensive. There are some people that for them, it is a skill to find out that person's Jewish. Right. And they confront you on being a Jew.
Right.
And
been in that conversation.
Yeah. So anyway, the first question I wrestled with one of my friends that I grew up with via Facebook is Archie Allen, who's a black, now All-American wrestler from Columbia University, who is now the principal at Sodus High School. And I asked the question, talk to me about Black Lives Matter. Why are we saying Black Lives Matter? Certainly all lives matter, don't they? His response was this: of course all lives matter. But it's like if the fire department went to a street where there is one house burning, but there were 9 other houses not burning, and started like dousing the flames that weren't there on the other 9 houses and the one, well, that would be ridiculous, right? And I said, yeah. So that's why we're talking about Black Lives Matter right now in America. That's why we've been talking about it for the last 7+ years at this point, really a decade at this point, with Freddie Gray in St. Louis, the St. Louis suburbs. That's why it's because predominantly black male lives are being extinguished at an alarmingly high rate by police officers. And you know what? People that are, Mark Twain once said they're liars, damned liars, and statisticians. There are many people on the other side of the aisle that would argue that statistically speaking, those deaths of black men or black lives at the hands of police are statistically low. And they would also argue insignificant. And my retort would be, insignificant to whom?
Right.
And if it's insignificant to you, that's a problem.
Yeah.
Because one life lost, one life snuffed out prematurely by an error in policing is one life too many.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Right. All right. So this culturally responsive, sustaining education. Talk to us a little bit about that. What is that? Because we know the uproar about.
Sure.
I'm blanking on the other concept.
CRT, which stands for, hold on, it's in there.
Yeah.
It's critical race theory. Thank
right?
you.
So, so there's this screaming about critical race theory, which people don't understand. And I worry that this is just going to fall into that category.
it already has, Keith.
Right.
And quite honestly, when we bring up anti-racist education,
right.
Let me say that again. When we bring up anti-racist education, parents and individuals in this community have picketed outside of elementary schools,
right,
saying that they don't want their children taught anti-racist education because it's making them feel bad about being white.
Yeah.
I couldn't think of something that's more ridiculous, Keith. I really can't.
Right.
Because when we're talking about anti-racist education, what we're saying is we're beyond a time in our history where we can simply be non-racist, which many would describe as you're at the water cooler and someone tells a racist joke. And non-racist would be not laughing about it.
Right.
Anti-racist would be saying, it wouldn't be like walking over to him and jacking him up and beating him up and kneeing him in the crotch. No, it would look more like, hey,
not okay.
That's not okay.
Yeah.
And if you're going to tell those kinds of jokes, tell them somewhere else, but please don't do it around me.
Yeah.
That's anti-racism. That's what we're trying to teach our young people. Because if there was more of that, there would be less hate.
Right.
So anti-racist education and culturally responsive education are related. And critical race theory, by definition, critical race theory is simply looking at the systems of oppression that are either de facto or de jure, meaning that have come to be by chance or in happenstance,
right,
or have come to be by law and policy and procedure,
right,
and fighting against them,
right,
and saying that that's not okay in 2022.
right.
But let's put that aside. Let's say, all right, critical race theory, that's bad. It's politically motivated. Comes from scholars such as Cornell, West, and Gloria Ladson-Billings, and very learned black folk, by the way. But they're politically motivated. Fine. Put that aside for a second. But let's talk about culturally responsive, sustaining education. That simply means what we're trying to do is make sure that every single child and every single family has a place where they feel welcome in our schools. That schools are a welcoming place. And if you don't want that for my kid, then I've got a real problem with that.
Right.
And if you don't want that for a black kid because they're black, or if you don't want that for a Latino kid because they're Latino, or an undocumented family because they're undocumented, I have a real problem with that. And you should too.
Right. Or a gay kid or a trans kid, right? Or
every child, regardless.
Right. And yet we know, right? All we have to do, from up here in New York is look south, right? We know there are states where they are clearly passing laws that we do not talk about this. We just don't even talk about this. And I'm with you. This entire narrative about us white folk are going to feel uncomfortable. Well, there's a part of me, Steve, that says, shit, yeah, right? Let us feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Because sometimes that discomfort creates learning. Sometimes that discomfort creates a moment for me to say, okay, because you said this earlier and I so related to that. growing up in a white suburb, as I did, white middle-class Jewish kid in Westchester County, right? It wasn't until a couple of years ago for me that I read White Fragility that I'm reading it and I'm thinking, holy shit.
Yeah.
I never stopped to ask myself, why did I live all around white people?
Right. Right.
I just never asked.
Yeah.
It wasn't something that we were asked to think about. And in that moment, was I uncomfortable? Yes. Mm-hmm. Good opportunity for some learning.
Well, I'll take it one step further, Keith. So that book, Robin DiAngelo's
Right.
White Fragility, wonderful primer on this whole idea of privilege and being white in America. Tim Wise's predates Robin DiAngelo. He wrote White Like Me, I believe. So basically, you have these two authors in the last 2 decades that have been saying, come on, white people.
Right.
We need to open our eyes and realize, and this isn't being woke. No. This isn't about patting myself and being a good white ally. No, this is about bringing about positive racial change so that our children can grow up in an equitable world. Because in my opinion, if we fail to bring about equity and equality in our world, then we're just kicking the can down the road to our children and grandchildren again, and we're letting them inherit a world of hate and difference, and it's not okay. And so going back to 5th grade, I'll never forget when I asked that question: why is it, Mr. Adams, that I live in an almost white neighborhood, almost all white neighborhood. In fact, growing up in West Irondequoit, I could count on one finger or one hand. It was at one point, there was one black child in our school. In elementary school, there was one black child and one Chicano family.
Right.
And that was it. And I asked in 5th grade, what is going on? How did this happen? Well, Mr. Lysenko, glad you asked that. It's de facto racism. White people choose to live with white people and black people choose to live with black people. And that is true to a certain extent. Right. However, Justin Murphy, local writer for the Democrat and Chronicle, just wrote a wonderful book that studies racism in Greater Rochester area, and it does a nice job of explaining the policies and procedures and laws and rules and regulations of redlining that were in place by banks, and actually it was implemented by HUD right after World War II, and it was saying loans can go to white people in predominantly white neighborhoods, and black people, it's going to be really hard for you to get loans and to own your own property. And because of that, the poor, black people in America have, and right here in Rochester, have remained poor. It's been extremely hard in the 50s, 60s, and even into the 70s for their family to own property, and therefore they lose out on that generational wealth that we all have had the benefit as white folk of accumulating and passing down in one form or another from one generation to the next.
Right.
And that's something that people don't realize. In fact, if you were to Google 5-Star Bank, Rochester, New York, 2015, there was a case where 5-Star Bank was found guilty of redlining. So these policies, practices, and procedures in banks still exist right to this very day.
Yeah.
It hasn't gone away.
I just read an article a couple of weeks ago in the Rochester paper, but I don't remember where it was. It wasn't Rochester, but it was highlighting this practice in communities of color historically, where people of color do purchase their home, but they don't get the deed until they have completely paid off the mortgage.
Ooh. Wow. Well, that's news to me, Keith.
Right.
But
I had never heard of that. And the difficulty of how many people end up defaulting, and then we're back to the passing on of generational wealth that doesn't happen.
Yeah. And another, actually one of my former wrestlers from our Spry Middle School days, Keith, Shane Wiegand, he has been a teacher and advocate for racial equity in his classroom, and has been part of pushing the Pathstone Foundation's anti-racist curriculum. And simply put, it goes through in a very non-judgmental, very objective way of presenting these facts of this is our history. This is a part of history that you might not have heard of in Rochester. where not only was there redlining, but there were restrictive deeds in place, meaning there were clauses in deeds. My wife, her first house that her family owned was in Brighton, in the Meadowbrook settlement neighborhood. And in there, the deed said, this deed, now it was originally written in the 1920s or 30s, this deed may not ever be transferred to anybody that's Negro, was the term used at the time, Jewish, Catholic, of Italian descent, and the list went on. So basically, if you were white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, and not an immigrant, could you technically have that deed.
Right.
And that's less than 60, 70 years ago.
That's right.
And if you were to do a search of the deeds in the greater Rochester area, you would find that those restrictive covenants, although they're no longer valid and they're not enforceable because there was a Supreme Court ruling back in the 70s that said they're invalid, those covenants still exist today. And here's what's even greater. People are paying, like there are organizations, not-for-profits, that are having to pay state and local governments to get those deeds rewritten and those restrictive covenants taken out of them. I would think that as a state or local legislator, that maybe we would give them a pass.
Right.
That maybe that would be seen as a blemish or a black eye on our local community. That we might really want to get rid of those restrictive covenants and just make it a blanket. We're getting rid of it. Right. But no, I mean, that's frustrating.
Yeah.
That's frustrating.
Yeah. So what is as you've been doing this research and doing this work, what has been your experience? And again, you and I can maybe speak just for our area, for the Rochester, New York greater region. What has been the response of the outer ring of suburbs, the white suburbs, to culturally responsive, sustaining education or anti-racist work or whatever label we want to put on it? As this conversation is growing, as the chorus is growing, I'm assuming you're getting some pushback.
Well, it depends on how you look at it, Keith. Any more pushback than any other reform movement? I don't know.
Okay.
That being said, let's just look at the record. On or about June 9th, the Monroe County superintendents authored a letter that said, we are committed 100%, based on this moment in history. Again, that was about a week after the George Floyd incident went viral, and Rochester was literally burning. So a few days after Rochester burned, the Monroe County superintendents came out and said, we are committed to doing and implementing the culturally responsive sustaining education framework. We are committed to continuing critical dialogues like Rock to Change, formerly known as the Monroe County Youth Summit on Race, and considering other similar electives that introduce anti-racist education and philosophy into our schools, because discrimination in any form is not okay. So that was a couple months into the pandemic. There is an organization called the Regional Equity Network, which is all the people all the officials in the districts throughout the greater Rochester area, Monroe County, and others that are charged with, okay, here's the culturally responsive sustaining framework, implement it.
Right.
And then, there has been some excellent work done. Different districts from all over the nation or from all over the county have been trained via BOCES 2. The people from NYU, the Urban Institute, I believe it's called the Metropolitan Institute, have come in and done trainings on, basically train the trainer situations where teachers and educators could go back to their own districts and train up their own folk. And that's been very positive. But I think if you were to ask, to sum it all up, Keith, I think districts are moving in a positive direction. It just appears to me to be at a glacial pace. And I think if you were to ask the students that fall under that category of other, whatever way that they're othered in, basically non-white,
right,
non-hetero, right. anybody that's gender fluid.
Right.
I think if you were to ask anybody what their experience is in predominantly white and suburban districts, is that it's not very positive, that they're struggling. I mean, in my time in Spencerport and the stories that I heard, and I will say this is not against Spencerport. This is just saying in talking with youth, particularly youth of color and gay youth, queer youth from all over Monroe County, they all had negatives. They all had their own stories, whether it was trying to get extra fries in the lunchroom or how many times they were called the N-word or they were called, that's so gay, or, stop being such a fag.
Right.
Just hearing that hateful language and having adults around them not react to it at all as though they didn't hear it.
Yeah.
It's unacceptable.
Yeah.
And gone are the days, in my opinion, that we can just throw our hands up in the air as K through 12 educators and say, I don't know how to deal with this.
Yeah, kids will be kids. Right.
Baloney. No. If it was your child and your child were gay, if your child were black, if your child were brown, how would you want them how would you want that situation dealt with? Then deal with it that way.
That's right. And the other thing I think of as someone who spent 30 years in a white school district, and like you, I worked with wonderful people, wonderful, loving, white colleagues who don't see their bias.
97% of all educators in Monroe County are white.
Right.
97%.
Right.
40, wait, hold on. It's in there, Keith. I got to go back to my statistics. For the county, the county is 30.9% people of color. That's the entire county. Okay. But then if you go to Rochester City Schools, 90% non-white. 90% non-white being taught by a faculty and staff that is, the city schools are about 87% white faculty and staff.
Right.
I
had an experience my last year, and I know, again, you always want to be careful about saying anything because it's one kid. Mm-hmm. But it was this really cool African-American kid pissed off, and he had a right to be pissed off given some of the things in his personal and family life. And he wasn't very good at smiling, and he walked around looking pretty pissed off. And the number of my colleagues who would knock out and knew I was working with him. And I found the kid, he was insightful and thoughtful, angry, right? He wasn't an acting outer. He didn't get into fights. He never made any threats. When he got upset, he would escape. He'd leave school, right? But the number of my colleagues who during those few months I was working with him knocked on my door expressing concern about this young man and what he might do. And I could think of any number of white young men I worked with who I was way more worried about, like the potential of, bringing a weapon to school or something like that. People didn't knock on my door about them.
Yeah. So one of my students, Danya Subay, she's now in her 20s. How did that happen? So I didn't get any older, neither did you, Keith, but our kids keep growing up. So Danya Subay taught me something very valuable. We are not responsible for our first thought that comes to mind. Rather, it's the second one that counts. And everything you talked about in that situation is, I can relate to people being afraid of white people being afraid of black people.
Right.
And I'll tell you why. From the time I was young, I grew up in Irondequoit, and we would go to what was then Bowden's Bakery, and then it became Dankner's Bakery on Joseph Ave. Not a nice neighborhood, not predominantly white. It was a black neighborhood and a Hispanic neighborhood. And we would go to the bakery, and we would lock our doors the whole way there. And then it was like you had to hold your breath until you got inside because something was going to happen to you in broad daylight, and then hop back in the car. And I was raised by a Jewess.
Right.
And an immigrant from the Ukraine.
Yeah.
So these are people that, and my father went on to be an electrical engineer, very bright. This has nothing to do with people being bright. My parents are both wonderful people. Even my mother. Just kidding. Mom, you don't know technology, so she won't be listening to this anyway. But, bright people, compassionate people. My mom was an educator for 25 plus years and knew better. But we pass this along from generation to generation. And until white people deal with their irrational fear of black folk,
Right.
that started with, that great movie, A Birth of a Nation, that was shown on our White House lawn by Woodrow Wilson and company, where that initial thought of black people being rapists and thieves and they were going to terrorize white people, that's where that idea was born in America, and it spread like wildfire because we as white folk let it.
Yeah.
And it's time for us to stop that and unlearn that. And, at this point, how about we not pass this on to our next generation? How about we get really comfortable? How about, in fact, we invite black and brown people of different ethnicities than ourselves that might not even speak English as their first language to come into our homes and have dinner with us?
Right.
It's something that I can't remember happening as a child growing up.
Never happened in my house.
And it's something I observed in my own family that I was continuing. And, it took a conscious act by my wife and I, Jen and I said, have we ever had black friends over?
Yeah.
No, we haven't. Why not? We both have black friends. Why don't we invite them over sometime?
Right.
And and they're wonderful people. They are wonderful
people.
These individuals are wonderful human beings, just like any other friend of ours. So it shouldn't matter that they're black, but let's be intentional, white folk.
Yeah.
Intentionally, and think about who are your friends of color. If you haven't invited them to break bread or to have a couple adult beverages over at your house in front of your kids, do it, and do it now.
Yeah.
Normalize it in your own life so that it becomes normal for them in their lives as adults. It's not that hard.
You know what? It isn't that hard, and yet it is. Right? It is, because it requires us to take a step back. As we said a few minutes ago, it requires us to be uncomfortable, to allow ourselves to sit in that discomfort, to be curious, to not see ourselves as a bad person if we own bias and prejudice.
We all do.
Right. We all,
self-included.
All of us.
Any American, I would argue that anybody that has grown up and continues to live in the United States of America to this day, racism and prejudice is in the air. Yeah. It's just we are swimming in it, we are bathing in it. It's like a fish in water. Right. There were two fish swimming in the water, and an older gentleman fish came by and said, "How's the water today, boys?" And the fish said, "What water?" It's in that way that we are so unaware of the bias in our media, the bias in our textbooks, that we have to be conscious. And unfortunately, as white folk, it is going to be a lifelong journey, not a destination for us to unlearn all of these biases.
Yeah. Look, I know. So again, I grew up in this really nice, loving, white, middle-class, Jewish family. We were taught, and I'm putting air quotes around that for those listening, that you love everybody and everybody's the same. But there was a but, and the but never got talked about, but the but was there. And the big but in our house growing up, I think, this was, my brother and sister and I debate this. This is more a message I felt I heard, was don't trust anybody who's not Jewish, that you will eventually see anti-Semitism. And I've been aware of it in my adulthood, and I've worked really hard to move past it. And the really interesting, I guess would be the word I would use, is in the last post Donald Trump becoming president, it's full blown in me again. And I don't like it. I feel it. I feel a certain fear being a Jewish person in our country, in light of some of the rhetoric that goes on that side. And yet I find myself battling it because I don't want to, right? I don't want to look at everybody and think, until you can prove to me you're not an anti-Semite, you're an anti-Semite. But for me, it's there. It's a very powerful bias that is in me.
And Keith, I don't know that you're unjustified. And I don't, but isn't that quite a statement on where we are in America, where we are in Monroe County in this day and age, in 2022, that we we have to be looking over our shoulder, that we have to wonder,
Right.
who is it that's, that's plotting hate and harm against me or my loved ones.
No question.
And,
when the terrorists stormed the Capitol on January 6th, and I saw that person in the Camp Auschwitz T-shirt, or 6 million wasn't enough T-shirt.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I know they were just there for a tour that day, right?
Right.
They were just there for a tour.
Right.
But I look at that and I listen to, some of the other fringe, not so fringe anymore elements. Charlottesville comes to mind. And as a person of the Jewish faith, it's hard not to have that prejudice in me. And I feel very conflicted about it because I don't want it, but it's there. Because I want to be able to be understanding to all, but sometimes it's really hard. And look, and that's for me, in my experience, growing up in this country as a person of color or a student today, an LGBTQ member of the community, student in a high school or a middle school, it's a pretty painful place to be.
Yeah. And I would argue that, those thoughts about not trusting anybody else that's not Jewish to not be an anti-Semite, I would argue that, Black and brown friends of mine have expressed, that's how I was raised, to not trust other people. And then they've also gone on to say that even your skin folk ain't kinfolk, meaning that, whether, let's say you're Black, you can't trust every Black person to have your best interests in their mind too. And so there's a tremendous amount of mistrust amongst the Black community. And I would argue rightfully so. I would also say, there's mistrust in a lot of different ethnicities throughout our community. And rightfully so, because we as a community have failed to take on some of the most basic of issues and make sure that everybody has equitable access in our schools. Plain
All right,
and simple.
so it's I don't know, say it's 10 years from now. Let's be hopeful.
Yep.
It's 10 years from now, and this culturally responsive sustaining education has a good foothold. It's moving its way through our suburban schools. What's that look like?
There are four major principles that are a part of the culturally responsive framework. One is welcoming environment for all. 2 is professional learning. 3 is an inclusive curriculum and inclusive assessments. And I should know the 4th off the top of my head as well, but it's escaping me right now. But that being said, what would it look like? It would be the enactment of those 4 principles.
Okay.
And it would be that we would have classrooms where every family not only feels welcomed, but embraced. That when we're talking about curriculum and we're talking about the discussion of the United States history, that especially being right here in the heart of the Haudenosaunee Nation, we're starting, when we start talking about the history of the Americas, as it should properly be told, is that we're starting with the indigenous history. And it's not taught as an elective, it's taught as American history. It's not Indian history, it's American history, the history of the United States.
Yeah.
And we're talking about, and we're, that we have, if we're going to be a culturally responsive and sustaining school, and instead of just crime and punishment, we're going to have restorative conversations.
Right.
That would be helpful because, gone are the days when, somebody put it to me quite in black and white once. And they said, as an administrator, how many times have you suspended a kid out for 6 months for possession of a joint? I said at least 12 times. And what have you done to make sure that that student, got the counseling they needed in order to come back to school successfully and not using? I said, well, at that moment in time, we hadn't engaged in that. He said, so let me understand this. You want, and you could refer them to law enforcement, right? You want your law enforcement agencies to be your drug and alcohol counselors. Is that what you're saying for your own child? No. So what we need to start doing is changing our policies and practices to get the desired result for all of our children, regardless of how they broke the code of conduct.
Right.
And we need to think about, okay, instead of labeling them as a horrible, awful person in grade 3 and have that carry with them throughout the rest of their career, because it does, whether you're talking about a small district or a large district, they being the students will always remember that time when little Johnny or little Jane bit somebody in 3rd grade and forever was seen as the problem child. And if we continue to treat them as the problem child, guess what? They will be.
They will be.
How about we teach them how to rejoin the classroom and pro-social behaviors?
Yeah.
And I get it. As parents around the kid that's doing the biting back in those grade levels, that's uncomfortable. But what if it was your child? What would you want for them? What would you want for them?
Yeah.
But not at the sake of my child? Baloney.
Right. Yeah.
In the long run, it is at the sake of your child.
Look, you just brought up an interesting piece that is close to my heart. And it's, it's maybe kind of on the fringe of this entire conversation, but it is another marginalized population, another population of students who are seen as other, seen as less than, and that is students that struggle with substance use disorder. Mm-hmm. And as you said, we have historically, and I need to own, I was a part of that course for many years. You suspend them, you suspend them, you suspend them. And in the field of substance use disorder work these days, we have, over the last 10, 15 years, have done a whole lot of rethinking of all of that, of a lot of the punishment-oriented narratives that have infiltrated the field, including with students. You need to suspend them, get them out. They're bad people. And it's fascinating because I, last year, was invited to spend some time in the GOAL program, the alternative program at Webster Schools that I helped to start many years ago. And as a result of that conversation and they asked me to come in and spend a day or two a month talking with kids around substance use, decisions around that. And as a part of the invite to come back to do that, I had the opportunity to speak to somebody in upper administration who was expressing at the time some interest in me maybe doing some training with the district staff who deal with the issue of substance use. And I said to this person, I'd be happy to, but let me tell you right from the get-go, here's what I would bring, because it's very different than the conversation I was a part of for 30 years. I would bring multiple pathways of recovery, which is where the field is going. Mm-hmm. I would bring harm reduction, moderation. I would bring what we understand about ambivalence to change, what we now understand with your 15 and 16-year-old when we say to them, you need to be abstinent for the rest of your life. And they just lie to us and tell us, right? And I would be more than willing to come and do training if the district was willing, not tomorrow do away with suspension, would be willing to start the conversation to do away with suspending kids who get caught under the influence or in possession of. End of the conversation right there. Yeah. End of it. Yeah. That, our administrators would be uncomfortable. No. All right.
No. There's a way of going about it, and, that indirectly ties into our conversations of marginalization. If you've ever seen the documentary 13th, it talks about the 13th Amendment and the growth of the exponential growth of the for-profit prison system.
Right.
The vast majority of people in prisons are black and brown. They're mentally ill black and brown people. Right. And many of them have been incarcerated for years under pretenses of what would now be forgiven as a minor marijuana possession, but it was right in the heart of the war on drugs of the Reagan era, the 1980s, that they're still rotting in jail because of the 3 strikes and you're out policy of the 80s and 90s.
Right.
There's been very little done to take a look at how did those laws impact families, and then talk about generational trauma. You have a family member, your father was incarcerated.
Right.
And you're black. You're now 75. What is it? I forgot. 75% of those of black males whose parents, one or both parents, have been incarcerated end up incarcerated themselves.
Right.
So, and that's not getting into causality, but that's just looking at the statistics of it all.
Right.
So, until we start, breaking those chains of incarceration, harm, and trauma, then there will always be those that have and those that have not, those that are the evil in society and those that are the good people in society. Yeah. And I don't raise your hand if you have anybody that's been incarcerated in your life.
Right.
In a white suburban district, that's going to be almost none.
Right.
Whereas if you go into what was the most recent statistics in RCSD? I want to say 4 out of every 7.
Right.
4 out of every 7 kids' parents, one or both parents are incarcerated.
Look, and if you want to start the causality conversation, there's trauma.
Yeah.
Right? Because when we know in the work, the ACEs work,
Yeah.
one of the adverse childhood experiences is an incarcerated parent,
100%.
right? And the impact of that absence and that type of absence.
And being black in a predominantly white suburban school district,
Yeah.
I would argue is traumatic.
Yeah.
Because there's this concept called behavioral modulation. I was at this conference and I heard this gentleman very eloquently explaining behavioral modulation to me and the rest of the people attending, and talking about these 4 black students that were at school in a predominantly white suburban district, and how these students engaged in behavioral modulation by going there. And he gave examples of like pulling up their pants and changing the way, like making sure that their shirt tails were tucked in, and taking off their hats or wearing their hats so that the brim faced forward.
Right.
Talking in a very proper white sounding accent. And it was only within the safety of what this study called Little Africa, which was a table in the back of the library,
right,
where these 4 young men could speak in, African American lexicon, in their authentic language, having a good time with each other, and maybe get a little loud.
Yeah.
And that was the only place in that school where that was okay. And then I texted my students, my black and brown students back in Spencerport when I was at this conference in 2017, and said, that's what this is called. What do you guys think about this? And they're like, Mr. Lysenko, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's exactly what happens to us on an everyday basis.
Yeah.
And there's a great book written by Beverly Daniel Tatum's called Why Do All the Black Kids Sit Together in the Cafeteria? And, for years, the thought was, well, we need to mix everybody up. No, that couldn't be more harmful, especially if there's only a very small number of students of color in your school. No, they need a space where they feel safe and secure.
Yeah. I read an article a number of years ago. I wish I had held on to it because I don't remember the author or the name of the article. But it talked about the impact on people of color, on their mental health, of always being told racism doesn't exist.
Right.
And so here's this thing that has such impact on me, but the majority culture says, oh, but it doesn't exist.
Well, so there's a researcher who's coming to town, Dr. Kiyanyame is working with his colleagues, and actually NAME of New York State is co-sponsoring the event in September. I'll make sure I get you and your listeners the information, but it's the Recovering and Healing Conference, in which we're bringing in Dr. Joy DeGruy, who her thesis is on. It's called post-traumatic slave syndrome. And it's looking at the generational effect of trauma, the epigenetic effect. So basically, because there has been trauma over generations, the genome of African Americans in this country, in particular African Americans, has been changed and morphed. Not because black people are different than white people. It is because the amount of stress and trauma, the hormones, and there, she goes into a great deal of detail about the science of it, and basically saying because there's so much stress and trauma experienced that the DNA of black folk in America gets bathed in these chemicals, which has altered them and continues to alter that to the day, and brings about all kinds of problems with brain development and things like that.
Yeah, it's fascinating and so important for us to stay on top of. So listen, I wanted to highlight those 4 frameworks that you talked about.
Thanks for helping me cheat.
Yes, the framework is grounded in 4 principles: welcoming and affirming environment, high expectations and rigorous instruction, inclusive curriculum and assessment, and ongoing professional learning.
So high expectations for all is the one that I left out earlier. High expectations for all. There's a fascinating study by Mohammed Khalifa, 2014, and it was talking about the fact that teachers were pretty much giving black kids a pass, saying, you know what, just do your best, show up to class, I'll pass you along.
Right. And
what Khalifa said is that black administrators who admonished their teachers for doing this, and then set the expectation that their teachers had high expectations for their students, especially their black students, guess what? Achievement in black students rose.
Right.
It seems commonsensical, but we're not doing any favors by, quote unquote, just passing students along. That doesn't mean that we have higher standards for black and brown students. That doesn't mean that we lower the standards, but it means that we hold them accountable. But at the same time, keep in mind that their lived experience in our schools and in our world is a little different than the white kids as they walk through this world.
Steve Lysenko, thank you. This has been a wonderful, fascinating, maddening conversation. But I am thrilled that people like you are pushing this conversation forward. There's work to be done.
Well, Keith, it is a pleasure, and I do this work not as a white savior, but in really echoing this quote by Desmond Tutu, in which Desmond Tutu says, "My humanity is bound up with yours, for we can only be human together."
Yeah. Amen. Thank you, my friend. Appreciate you making the time to be with us today.
Thank you, Keith. My pleasure.
If you were interested in learning more about Steve's work, maybe even make contact with Steve, engage him in some conversation, look at the podcast notes and his website. The URL for his website will be there. Please reach out to him and become a part of this conversation. It's incredibly important and crucial if we're to move forward as a nation and as a world. So I thank you for joining us today and sitting in on this episode of the Helping Conversation. And I invite you to be with us the next time that we continue to shine a light on the skill and talent of those individuals that invite another into that compassionate, complex, and intimate space called the Helping Conversation. Everybody have a great day.
We thank you for sitting in on our discussion today on just one unique version of the Helping Conversation. We would love to hear your thoughts on today's podcast, so we sincerely invite you to follow, rate, and most importantly, review our episodes. For more information on Keith Greer and this podcast, log on to keithgreercoaching.com. Please join us for our next episode as we continue the exploration and celebration of the practice, art, and science of the Helping Conversation.